Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to this session. I'm Jean-Paul Judson, delighted to be with you, to be your moderator today. This is a panel sponsored by Corteva Agriscience, and I would just like to say one thing. It's a tough life to be a plant breeder. It's a tough life. I mean, either you go around a bit in the blind for many, many years and finally get to a few varieties that you can place on the market relatively easily, or you start to develop tools that allow you to be much less in the blind, but then you get, some regulatory processes that might make it very difficult to get your new varieties onto the market. Maybe you even don't know if you can get to the market with those new varieties. And so this is the kind of challenge that we'll be discussing today. We'll be looking at gene editing. It's multiple different angles. We'll be looking at some of the benefits, issues around intellectual property, and also licensing. I would like to welcome our 4 panelists today. I am joined to my left with Ania Lukasiewicz. She is Researcher Policy and Regulation of NGTs, New Genomic Techniques at Wageningen University and Research. We have over on the far end Dan Jenkins. He is Vice President for Regulatory and Government Affairs at Pairwise. Claudia Hallebach in the middle is Head of Global IP at the KWS Group. And Arend Streng, he is Patent Specialist at Rijk Zwaan. Can you give them a warm round of applause? So I'd like to kick off this session by allowing the audience to get to know you a little bit better. Ania, could you just summarize in a nutshell what your organization is doing in terms of research on gene editing?
Yeah, so I'm Ania. I'm at Wageningen University in Research and specifically in the Department of Plant Breeding. I'm working on policy, but in my department there are a lot of researchers that work with gene editing on a lot of different traits in different crops. So a lot on disease resistance, but also, for example, abiotic stress, so salt tolerance, heat tolerance, and so on. And I'm a little bit special in that department as I'm the only one that's really working with policy, so I'm trying to make the link between research and policy.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you. Arend, what are you working on in terms of gene editing?
Thank you, Jean-Paul. Rijk Zwaan is a vegetable and fruit breeding company, and we have about 28 or 30 vegetable and fruit varieties, species that we are breeding in. So that means that we are focusing on a lot of crops, and first of all, we are focusing on a few in order to see whether or not gene editing can be applied in these crops and how efficiently you can work on all kind of protocols in order to be implementing the edits that are needed in breeding, or at least to see how edits can be applied.
Brilliant. Thanks for keeping to the nutshells here. Claudia, please.
Yes, hello. My name is Claudia, and I'm working for KWS. And KWS is a seed company, a seed specialist, and we are more than 160 years old and family-owned, and we are actually active in many different crops. And we see a lot of potential in the new genomic techniques in all our crops. We are active in many different ones. At the moment, we are still doing research in that area, identifying genes and sequences where we can apply the new technologies. But we see lots of potential, in particular, to support sustainable agriculture, and want to develop traits in all our crops, but mainly in corn, sugar beet, cereals, sunflower, and then traits like fungal resistance or pest resistance, virus resistance. So all these applications where we as a seed specialist can really also be a differentiator and provide the traits which are needed in EU Green Deal situation, climate change situations, and where we can contribute with that.
Okay, so you're already making that link with sustainable agriculture. We'll get back to that. Dan, what are you working on?
Hi, and thanks for having us. I'm Dan Jenkins with Pairwise. It feels funny sitting next to you because we're only 6 years old. So we're young, and we're a startup in the United States, based in North Carolina. So we're using gene editing and CRISPR specifically to improve fruits and vegetables. But we've also worked across a total of about 16 different crops. We introduced the first gene-edited produce into the United States this past year, which was an edited mustard green. So it made something that was highly nutritious, much more attractive for consumers to eat. The idea is that if we can improve fruits and vegetables, then people will eat more of them, which is obviously got a lot of benefit for diet and related disease. And of course, if people are eating more fruits and vegetables, there's certainly a carbon benefit to that as well. So that's what Pairwise is doing, and we're trying to use gene editing to benefit consumers, farmers, and the environment.
So if I may stick to that, Dan, is that the sort of main benefit you're looking at moving forwards from gene editing, would be this sort of nutritional value that you can bring to varieties, to food? Is that what the main benefit that you're looking to bring?
No, actually, so we're working across the board, and we work with other companies to do editing for them, as well as license out our technology to other companies who can then use it as well to achieve whatever their goals might be. But we are working on multiple traits. I think some of the funnest ones, like maybe a pitless cherry, would be a pretty interesting thing that wouldn't be necessarily a change in its nutrition, but the idea is to get people to eat more of something that already is nutritious.
Okay, and Ania, as a sort of more fundamental research level, what are the main benefits that you see that gene editing can bring?
I think the main benefits are for specific crops, because it's really efficient for polyploid crops or vegetatively propagated crops. Of course, there are some disadvantages, such as the efficiency of the enzyme for gene editing or the delivery of the technique. And then, of course, the regeneration of the plants. But at Wageningen, at least, we work on a lot of different traits. So mostly, like I said, in plant breeding, disease resistance, but also other traits that could be beneficial for sustainability. But there's also a group working, for example, in ornamentals, so changing the color of a plant.
And Claudia, you were talking about the benefits in relation to more sustainable agriculture. Could you maybe say a little bit more about the specifics of those benefits in terms of the research that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, I just want to make this sort of overall, link. I mean, the EU Green Deal has quite some challenging objectives. By 2030, we are expecting quite many changes in our agriculture towards a more sustainable agriculture that is much less chemistry in the fields, protection products, also less fertilizers and more accurate for organic products. And that means that we will most likely lose productivity. And we need to sort of compensate that loss by plant breeding. Yeah, so our plants need to perform much better than they currently do. The current speed of innovation is just not sufficient, to meet the objectives, because 2030 in terms of plant breeding is tomorrow. And therefore we really expect then the speeding up of the breeding with that. And that is what we also see in our internal research, that we sometimes can reduce the development times for certain traits by half of it. And I think that is where the real potential is with the new genomic techniques, that we can speed up the innovation for the benefit of all in order to really meet the challenges which we are currently already in.
Okay, and Arend, if I just bounce back on that, then would you say that the biggest benefit is on this speeding up of the process, especially in your markets, on the horticultural area, or is it more for the end use?
Well, I think indeed, you picked already my topic, but indeed speed is definitely key. I mean, for vegetables, fruit crops, breeding times are generally from 7 to 17 years. So especially if you see carrot or brassicas, you are dealing with very long breeding times before a variety hits the market. So in that sense, I think gene editing can bring definitely speed to the toolbox, because I think gene editing should be seen as an addition to the toolbox besides important other breeding techniques. So of course gene editing is important, but other breeding and classical breeding is also still very important, especially when you look at horticultural crops, in which still a lot of biodiversity is available for breeding. So that means that you also should investigate first the biodiversity and the broad existence of other, for example, resistance genes in wild relatives. And with gene editing, you can then efficiently and effectively and speedily integrate the right genes into your variety.
So here we're talking about the promise of the technology. At the same time, this promise will meet a specific regulatory environment, which will be global, although that will be broken down into lots of different jurisdictions. And there's a lot of movement and discussion and debate around this topic. Maybe if I stick with you, Arend, how do you see the developments there? I mean, do you see that regulatory developments are a concern to make that promise a reality? Or on the contrary, do you see some, positive examples where there might actually be some real commercial opportunities coming out of this?
I think, for Zwaan, we're still working on research. So for commercial opportunities, we're still very early. I would say first let's see what genes are there and how the edits can be made. But with regard to the regulatory environment, I definitely see that worldwide there is a positive tendency. I see in most countries, especially North America, South America, you see positive developments as regards to the easy regulatory process in order to bring varieties to the market. And of course in Europe, and I think a lot of people in this room will know about that, developments are, there is a proposal and there are discussions, but it's still very difficult to reach an agreement within Europe, but I definitely see that the developments are positive. And so that means that, Claudia just mentioned that 2030 is tomorrow in breeding. That means definitely we can prepare for those developments.
Okay, Dan, please, what do you see? What's your confidence in the future for commercial opportunities?
I'm pretty confident, but if I could, I kind of want to take a step back for a second and maybe bring in the efficiency of breeding and then bring it forward into the regulatory conversation. So for us, when we did an edit in the brassica, the mustard green, that's something that is a tetraploid, and we just did a knockout in that. And we went and spoke to people that were familiar with vegetable seed and said, hey, we're working on a new variety. And I was told that the reaction from that potential partner was, oh, maybe we'll see you in 5-6 years, if at all. So with editing, we achieved proof of concept in about 6 months and then shocked them. And in corn, we've done some work with some friends of ours at Bayer where we worked on a trait to improve yield. And it's doing well, and there's been, we'll see what the actual percentage of yield increase is, but so maybe somewhere in that 5 to 10% increase. And that's something that would probably normally take decades with traditional breeding. And that was maybe under 2 years to do that. So now by comparison, that mustard green that we worked on, we went through Chile and Guatemala and Honduras and the US and Canada. And the time to move it through regulatory was even less than 6 months to achieve the edit, which was great. So generally speaking, I would say that not only the time, but even the amount of information required was, especially for me as a person who used to work in GMO, is a breath of fresh air. And so we feel pretty optimistic, but there's still a lot that needs to be worked out, particularly here in the EU.
Okay, and Claudia, you were talking about the EU. How do you see that promise being met by the regulator here in the EU?
Oh, yeah, okay. that is a tricky one. But just saying it from the perspective of a globally active breeding company, I mean, we of course need to look at different maps of the world, yeah, and then of course the regulatory landscape is pretty important, yeah, and it doesn't make our life easier if things are regulated differently in each country of the world, yeah, and what we see in terms of tendency is that in particular these SDN1 approaches, category 1 traits as they are called then here in Europe, I mean, they are often not regulated in many countries, yeah, so I mean there's huge market potential and we already see first varieties being commercialized, and then we wonder, hey, and where are we in Europe, yeah, I mean there is now a proposal from the European Commission which is promising, which forms a basis, but now we find ourselves in the middle of a debate on IP, yeah, which is the hindering factor. So there was a certain momentum, which really we were quite optimistic, and we hope we can still sort of keep that moving. But I think EU needs to be really careful not to miss out on opportunities here where the rest of the world is already sort of using them and applying them.
Yeah, you mentioned IP, and I will want to ask a couple of questions around that as well. I think it is important. Before I go there, Ania, I mean, I don't know how close you are, let's say, to actual commercialization of varieties that might be coming from gene editing. But I think also it would be interesting to understand your perspective on the regulatory framework when it comes also to research and how much that also might be affected, not so much only the commercialization, but does it also affect your ability to carry out research on these techniques?
Yeah, I think it will be definitely a few years before there are any crops on the market, at least from Wageningen, because I think a lot of researchers are waiting until there's really a decision made on the European level. But on a fundamental level, there's definitely interest, because I have researchers come up to me asking how they can use it and how to put crops on the market. So there is interest, but I think a lot of, at least groups, organizations are still waiting until they get the green light from Europe.
Okay, so we come to some of the challenges around these techniques, at least from the regulator side. And it's true that one of those that comes up is around intellectual property. So what would be interesting to understand is, in your words, what is actually that challenge? And what would you be prepared to accept in terms of a compromise when it comes to intellectual property? Because obviously there's a lot of investment going on by companies in these techniques. The question is, how much do you need to protect those? And how much the regulator will allow you to protect those? So could you maybe, Arend, maybe first kind of try and describe that challenge, maybe from the regulator's perspective, and then how much would you be willing to compromise on this kind of issue?
Yeah, from a regulator's perspective, I would say, first, I think it's a society in Europe. I'm talking Europe now. It's a societal debate, and then with regards to, I mean, the discussion is being held in the democratic arena, I would say. So there are a lot of stakeholders involved in this topic, because plant breeding, apparently, we heard this also this morning, is at the heart of consumers and at the heart of society. So this means that, yeah, this discussion is broad, and I can imagine that all aspects of IP, so not only patents but also plant breeders' rights, are at the table, and this means from this broad discussion, which is already there in the European arena for, I would say, ages, I can imagine that this is now also part of this discussion around gene editing and the new legislation. And from Zwaan, we always have said that plant breeders' rights are key for breeding companies to protect their varieties in order to bring innovation to the market. And that patents extending to biological material, patents should not be extended to biological material, and in this, in order to, because that would block innovation in our view. So with the current discussions and the current developments, I think we as a company could live with that, because we think plant breeders' rights, variety protection is essential for a plant breeding company to regain its investment, and that's also enough.
Okay. Claudia, would you have a view on that, a different view?
I have a view on that, yeah. So actually, we are also a plant breeding company, and I can say that the plant variety protection is, of course, the IP right for the plant breeding. It's a sui generis IP right, tailor-made, yeah, for our needs. That is why it is very important for plant breeding, and we can protect our varieties with them. But on the other hand, and that is what I mentioned at the beginning, I mean, we are also active in the trade development, yeah, and we also find them very important to meet all the objectives which are ahead of us. And for this, and also to further the investment in such trade development, we also think that patents play a role in the IP landscape. But of course, the NGTs, I mean, that's a little bit new territory. They are coming with patents, yeah, and this is new to many European breeding companies. And that is why there are many concerns. And to be very honest, without a certain mitigation, I think that the patents would probably undermine the PVR and access the material, as also Arend just said, yeah, and that is of course a concern which we need to mitigate, and that is something where we need to ensure the access to the genetic material for further breeding, with limited breeders' exemptions, for instance. And another concern is, of course, that patents can lead to monopolies. I mean, this is also a valid concern. We have seen that in other territories of this world, yeah. So that is also something I think we believe patents should not be used to exclude others, but rather to invite others to use them, yeah. And that is why sharing innovation, licensing it, that is something we believe in. And the third really big concern we hear very often is, yeah, how do I know whether there is a patent included in a variety I want to access for breeding, yeah? And if I don't know, I rather don't touch the material, and this is of course also not what we want, yeah? It would be very detrimental to innovation, and that is why the transparency element is another issue we need to solve. And in Europe there is now this database which was developed by Euroseeds, which is called Pinto, and there you can get an overview on patented traits and varieties. So I think with these measures, I think there is a way forward to mitigate the situation and go for a coexistence of the two IP regimes.
Yeah, because I mean, Arend was talking about the societal perspective, but there is also clearly coming from both of your interventions an industrial perspective as well. I mean, there are different industrial strategies, let's say, that will be using different intellectual property mechanisms. And so maybe Dan as well, I'd like to hear you on this, you know, maybe actually to frame also the challenge from the regulator's perspective. On intellectual property. I would really like to hear that from you, and then how you are responding to that as a company.
I'm not sure I know how to frame it exactly from the regulator's perspective, but I'm gonna try to give you a perspective, and you can tell me if I'm anywhere close. So look, we're a small company. We have 120 people, and we are still paying those 120 people and all the research. And you pay for all the failures too, through people being willing to invest in us. And especially when you're working in crops like trees, and a trait that will take a very long time and is aiming for this societal benefit, that if there isn't something at the end of that that allows there to be an equitable sort of context for recouping on that investment, they won't invest in us in the first place. And so I would argue actually that patents are what provide democratization of the technology, that they are what prevents market concentration. Because our view is that if we don't have that at the end of that long amount of investment and research, and we're working in crops where maybe the genomes aren't even well understood. We have to do basic research and transformation systems and all this. So at the end of that long road, I don't think you'd give me $1 if that trait, the moment we entered the market, could just be, in a sense, taken. We also have to pay fees for licenses to use CRISPR in the first place. So I think that without them, that I think very big companies will be fine. That little companies like ours that are trying to get started and actually bring innovation will not be. And so I think you have to think about this not in terms of defense, but rather how do you cultivate a system, and maybe this is from the regulatory perspective, that actually encourages and develops innovation from within rather than trying to defend from without. I think that the regulatory perspective here has to be, how do we create something that is equitable for breeders as well, but that allows and encourages investment in the first place.
Okay, so there are slightly different perspectives, and this is more on an industrial, let's say, a strategy. From a research perspective, what is your view on intellectual property then?
Yeah, so Wageningen University and Research both works with patents and plant breeder sites. When I talk to researchers and also the smaller breeding companies, they're really in favor of plant breeder sites. And I think that's also the position of most SMEs in the Netherlands, but also from the Dutch government. I think Dan did point out some interesting issues, because I think there's also a difference between the crops that you use. In some crops, patents will be really interesting, in others not. So I've been talking to apple breeders, for example, and for them, plant breeder sites are enough, because the breeding cycle, even using gene editing, is still quite long to get enough revenue back. But in other crops, for example, tomato, plant breeder sites might not be enough to get enough revenue to pay for the license for the technology, for example. And then some certain adjustment will need to be in place, at least at the European level. So there are both advantages and disadvantages for both IP systems.
Okay, and so there are different strategies, but then the reality, because here this is a bit theoretical, let's say, but then the reality is that all of this will come in one shape or another. It'll probably be everything at once. And so you've already talked about some of the tools that are out there that might help make the process a little bit easier for everyone to get access to information and to be able to work with all the materials out there, and however they might be protected, some of the traits that are out there and however they might be protected. Could you maybe then explain in a bit more detail a couple of examples of some of the partnerships maybe that are out there that are facilitating this? Maybe Arend, you can give it a first go, and how important those partnerships will be moving forwards as well to convince regulators, convince society at large that this will be possible.
Well, yeah, indeed. Well, for Zwaan, I think the international licensing platform on vegetables is key to at least indeed be able to get access and to give not only for us as a company, but also for other companies, for other stakeholders. I mean, all legal entities can become a member. You don't have to own patents or have to be a patent applicant to be part of this international licensing platform. And there you are able, companies are able to put their patents in if they have any, and at least come with fair and reasonable the terms, and you can, with fair and reasonable terms, you can come to an agreement with other parties in order to be able to have access to that characteristic if it's patented. So that's, in that way, I think you can solve that, but that's only for biological material, access to biological material. I would say, and maybe that's also a discussion maybe we can have later, access to technology is also key. And as far as I know, there is no such a platform for the technology, for gene editing technology. So I will also call upon partners within which exploit gene editing technologies to also come up with such a platform in order to have access also for companies, breeding companies of all sizes, in order to be able to democratize the technology, also to apply it in all crops.
So just to push you a little bit more on that, can you be a little bit more specific? Can you give an example of what could happen through such a platform? What's your idea? What's your vision there?
If access is also, I would not say it should be the same. I just call upon all players to work together in order to make access to the technology also easy for all. That's what we at least tried with the ILP vegetable platform, to have patents on biological material accessible for all parties, to do that also for patents on technology, because I am also active within the Dutch Plant Breeders Association, Plantum, and when I have discussions there, I also often hear, but we don't know to which party we should go. How are things arranged? And if that is clearly arranged, for example, in a platform or in a pool or whatever you have, you might also be able to show to society that you're willing, I would say, to give access, not for free, but at least give access in order to be able to apply the technology, and in this way to contribute to the goals of plant breeding and vice versa.
Okay, thank you. And Claudia, you mentioned Pinto, I believe. So here we're more in the area of a database that provides information. But I imagine that moving forwards, there might also be a necessity to resolve certain conflicts maybe between companies when they're using different traits, or just understand how to use certain traits. Is there any sort of partnership being built in the industry to try and also help resolve certain conflicts that could appear?
Well, conflicts about patentability, that is out of scope. Yeah, that is for the European Patent Office and the courts to solve. But similar, like in vegetables, the ILP, there is in field crops, the agricultural crop licensing platform works in a similar way, like the ILP, because that was a little bit our role model. But there we have dealt with that, the licensing situation as such. I mean, the platforms, they provide for an all-in approach. Yeah, so as a company, you are actually, obliged to provide all your commercially available traits to the platform, and then you have to grant a license. And then there is a standard license agreement with all the terms defined. However, there's one thing not defined, and that is the royalties, yeah? So, and that was on purpose that we did not determine that, simply because each business case is different, yeah? And the value of a trade may also be considered differently by the parties. And therefore, that point is open, and we leave the parties 6 months to negotiate the terms, and if there is then no solution, yeah, then we have an arbitration mechanism in the platform that's also existing in the ILP, that is called the baseball arbitration. And here each party makes a proposal, and the arbitration panel can choose only the one or the other. So they cannot come up with a middle solution, they have to go for one or the other. And this is a huge incentive, yeah, for the parties to make a reasonable proposal, yeah, and because otherwise they may face a situation that the arbitrators go for the other one. And this is such an important tool that in ILP, which has been working with that instrument for years, there was not a single case, yeah, and that is sort of a proof of success, yeah, that just the fact that this arbitration thing is at the end sort of incentivizes and motivates the parties to come to a conclusion, and this is key, and I think that's a very good mechanism.
Okay, and Dan, how does your company then interact with some of these platforms that are more focused on the plant breeding? How do you interact with that actually in terms of this partnership? How do you see any elements that would need to be added to these platforms?
Well, I think you need to have one for trees and fruit, but look, we haven't had to interact with these very much yet, right? But I think that our view is that if there are frameworks like these that basically drive towards what should be a win-win in terms of licensing or whatever, I think we would be in favor of that. I think that what we all want is for this technology to innovate and deliver on all of these potential traits so that we can meet the things that we're all really concerned about, right? Climate change, et cetera. And so there has to be that incentive at the end, but we won't be successful as a company if it isn't truly a win-win for that person at the end, that grower, whoever it is. So again, if we begin to innovate in tree fruits and things, let's maybe use some of these as a model, but we'd be in favor of that. We want to have something that's equitable. Yep.
And as a research institute, do you also get involved in some of these platforms, or is it more of an industrial setting?
No, these platforms are definitely interesting also from at least the organization as Wageningen University Research. I do have to say that these platforms and also the Pinto database, it's voluntary, so it's not mandatory. The Pinto database does help in identifying what kind of patents there are on crops, but so like I said, it's voluntary. And a lot of the organic breeders that I've spoken to, they really don't want to work with any material that has a patent, because that's something they're really afraid of infringement and then having to destroy all of the crops. So I think expanding the Pinto database, maybe also on a European level, at least it's already on a European level, but making it mandatory, maybe in combination with registering the gene-edited crops, would really be beneficial.
So we're talking about, to some extent, how do we want to democratize this technology, but very much from a breeder's perspective, I would say. The other question is, how do we want to democratize it in terms of the end use? And the end use will usually be in the hands of a farmer or a grower. And I just wonder, how close are, let's say, your customers to all of this, to this discussion, to the research going on? How much do they know about the promise? And how quickly do you think they will be able to benefit from it? But in particular, how much of a support do you feel that they are in this process? Because maybe they feel still a bit far away from the outcome. It would be interesting to get a perspective on that. Claudia, maybe?
Yeah, I can give it a start. I think we have two target groups here. The one is the farmers we are working with, and the other then perhaps the end user who buys the products in the supermarket. For the farmers, we are a very close dialogue, yeah, and they definitely see the potential and the benefits of NGTs, so they're really open to get them, yeah, and that is why for them, I mean, they are benefiting from the innovation and from the trades. Yeah, for them, I think it's an easier storyline. For the consumers, just attended several events, yeah, where we had a public debate. It's still a difficult topic, I have to say. They are far away from agriculture as such, so talking about then specifically gene editing is difficult. It's a challenge, yeah. Nevertheless, when you then make the link to the climate change, to the Green Deal objectives, yeah, to securing food for all the growing population, I think then you get the people, yeah. And I also observed that the reactions and the discussions is not comparable with the conventional GM anymore, which happened a decade ago or even longer, but that people are more open because they see the challenges, they see that these technologies are being applied already in many other countries. So I think there is a certain openness, but we should play that even more, yeah? So we should do much more than in communication, education, explaining the benefits, because I see there a certain light at the end of the tunnel.
Okay. Arend, how is the dialogue going with growers? I mean, is there actually a demand for this?
A demand for gene-edited crops? As far as I know, they are not as vocal as other parties, but of course, for growers, it's important that speed is key. The faster you can get a certain new trait, I mean, we now see it with a devastating viral resistance in tomatoes. I mean, which is readily and fastly infecting a lot of growing areas for tomatoes. It's very important and key to have a fast resistance in a lot of different segments as tomato has. So I definitely think that they are, as our main customer, the customer, they are at least they have an interest in fast delivery of traits and characteristics to them in order to solve all kind of problems, not only in resistances, but also indeed mitigating climate changes. And on the other hand, they also share, I would say, on some aspects also. For example, just to pick out one of the aspects of the European legislation, the traceability, which is which is also a concern for them in order to arrange that in a farming situation or in a growing situation. So I think they are very much aware of all kind of developments and about the aspects of that come with gene editing. But we also should, I would say, work with them in order to bring not only as breeding companies, but also together with farmers, together with other stakeholders, the importance of breeding and also of gene editing to the consumer. And in the end, I think, and it's also what I observe, is that people, when concerned about their health, they look forward to all kind of new technologies in order to solve all kind of aspects in their daily lives. But as regards to plants that they also eat on a daily basis, there's much more uncertainty. So, and a much more also unclarity. And I think we should work together to solve that.
In terms of the public research, actually, I mean, is there sometimes a bit of a contradiction, let's say, between some of the funding and policy that you might get on the one hand to develop all of these techniques and this research, and on the other hand, this sort of more difficult debate then in society in terms of the actual end use of all of this? Isn't there a bit of a contradiction? Because at the end of the day, it's all about policy, right?
Yeah. So there's definitely a contradiction because gene editing is really hot in research. So a lot of researchers work with it. It's really useful also for gene discovery. However, when you look at the end product, customers have a different feeling about this. So if you call these gene editing the new GMO, then customers are often really negative towards it. So it's really about how you frame it. And I think Claudia already mentioned, if you frame it in a way that it's, you tell about lower pesticide use, for example, then customers are more accepting or willing to try these new products. What I've also heard is that customers do want to have a label, so they do want to know when they eat gene-edited products, but in the end they often don't look at the label, so it's more about they want to have all the information they can get and then make their own choice. So there's definitely a discrepancy about research and customer perception.
Okay, and Dan, because I mean you're really working on the technology, let's say, itself. I mean, how close are you actually to farmers and growers? How well do they understand the technology, and do you feel there's sufficiently a voice in this debate?
So I would say that we've had a lot of interaction with farmers, and what's kind of interesting is, particularly as policy has moved forward, I'd say specifically with the EU, we've had more outreach from certainly at least companies that say, we're interested now in this, which I think spurs some conversation with farmers a little more globally. In talking to farmers, they always have questions up front about the technology, and you have to explain why it's not GMO, and then they get really excited. I would say that for us, that when you're talking to farmers, they want solutions, obviously, for what they're dealing with in the field. How do you make this higher yielding, or drought tolerant, or whatever, or insect resistant? But you talk to consumers, and they want something completely different. And what's interesting in the consumer acceptance space, in our experience, is one, that the younger you go, the more accepting they are, and the more open to it they are. So I think that's really, I don't know, positive and something to take note of. And also that when we, rather than speaking and using sort of an educational deficit model and explaining the technology, we said, why don't you try taking a bite of the salad? But we told them it was gene edited. They had a great experience. And then you ask them afterwards, are you concerned about gene editing, biotechnology? No. Because if they have the experience, then that's how you gain acceptance if it's something positive. But those are different traits and different groups to work with. But I would say overall, we've had a very encouraging experience with both parties. But the kinds of things that you might do for a grower might be different than what you might do to really speak to a consumer. They're different groups. Yeah.
Okay, thank you for sharing these insights. We've had so far a pretty deep and thoughtful conversation. I'd like to bring you in. Do you have any questions or comments in the floor, in the audience? Has it sparked any questions? Please, yeah, over there. Briefly introduce yourself.
Thank you so much. My name is Olalekan Kimbo. I work for African Union Development Agency, NEPAD. That's AU organ from Africa. I really pick interest in Dan's conversation, and presently we are working on genome editing. I'm leading that program. And the issue of IP, and you made mention of your company is young, and you can struggle a little on some component, but big companies, they can really fly, and it's not a problem. Now bring that home to Africa that want to tap into the technology, that we're pushing, or we're making them to understand that genome editing is from GED, and potential is awesome, and it could also fit into Agenda 2063, agricultural purpose, one of the moonshots, the Africa we want. How do you now link it, or what is your perspective on how to reach out to a continent like Africa? You now that you have the product We don't have the product. Our scientists are working on it. And the IP is still an issue that we will discuss in another forum. But what's your perspective on that towards Africa for this technology?
So I want to be clear on the question. So our perspective on outreach and working with Africa, or yeah?
On the issue of the IPR, intellectual property right, that if you said a young company like yours could struggle, but big companies may not, if I get that conversation when you are making that point.
Well,
now, speaking of institutions in Africa, in a different perspective, how do you work with Africa in that perspective, knowing fully that you have the product ready? Africa, not yet. They're still on the research stage.
So I'm not sure. I want to make sure I'm responsive to your question. So again, tell me if I'm not. But look, we're just this little company seeking investment, and maybe there's some parallels there in terms of seeking investment for the research and delivering things. I don't know if the situation where you are is analogous to ours, in that, again, parties that may give us money to do this work, it's not like they don't have other choices as to where to put their money. There are lots of other areas that you might invest in besides agriculture, and in fact, many do. And so if you're trying to deliver something that has this benefit and you're trying to be successful and, again, grow and hire and bring this product to the marketplace to hopefully create that win-win for the growers, for society, and they're saying, well, do I invest in you or do I invest in data science? Right? There has to be something there to make that worthwhile. And of course, in the end, it has to be a win-win. We're not trying to do something that's unfair. We're actually trying to do something that creates a benefit. And so having that way to protect and get that return on investment, I don't know how you can get that if that isn't there to begin with. And I think that's important. So again, we're just a small company that's just getting started, and maybe there's some parallels there. But that's sort of my perspective.
I mean, maybe, I don't know if I'll try and rephrase, but I think there might be an element in the question as well of how would you imagine, let's say, the African continent here to build its own resilience, its own system, let's say, to allow companies potentially in Africa as well to get to the level where they are commercializing products and not necessarily only relying on products coming from outside. I imagine there might be an element of that in the question.
Well, I think you've got to have the regulatory system set up that allows you to get these things to the market, obviously, without costing quite as much as those things in the past. And then there has to be some sort of protections on the traits that you develop. And of course, they've got to be set up in such a way that gives you that protection, but then ultimately there's got to be an instrument for sharing it, and that allows people access as well. And patents will run out, but again, you've got to be able to get that return, and then you can stand up a business and begin to take that money and invest in developing other things. Because I know I just mentioned it for a moment earlier, but you're going to have a lot of failures, and they're really expensive. And so you've got to have something at the end that allows you to keep going forward and then get that return to make new things that can also serve your region. Yeah.
Any extra inputs? Yeah, please.
I think it also, I mean, Zwaan is also active in Africa, and I would say it takes a lot of time also to make, at least to breed the crops African people are willing to buy and consuming. So it takes also a lot of time, not only starting to breed, and I mean, I think companies are making that change. They are trying to seek partnerships in Africa, work together with African farmers, African companies, in order to really breed products, but it will take years, I would say. But I think definitely companies are trying to do so.
Okay, please at the back, briefly introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. I am Jacques Gauthier from Gauthier Seed, vegetable seed company in south of France. Many thanks to organize this presentation and debate. I have a question on gene patenting and natural gene or native gene patenting. Do you think that with this technique development, there will be what could be the development on natural gene patenting? Is it linked or not?
Who would like to tackle that one? Claudia, I see. Yep.
I can give it a start. Per se, I mean, the native traits, the genes which also occur in nature, they are excluded from patentability. Yeah, that was introduced into the patent laws, I think, in 2017, and they are sort of carved out from all patent applications which are on plants there. And the same holds true for the gene editing patents. Yeah, I mean, they're also carved out, and you have to add a certain disclaimer in your patent application, making that sure, yeah, that these genes are excluded. And that is the one thing, that is the law. But of course, there's the other element that you may still find patent applications where there are certain spillovers, or where it's just not 100% clear how the patent is to be read and understood. So here we are having a lot of discussions also in our industry, in our sector, how we can raise the bar, that the patent examination gets clearer on that, yeah. And also we're even having discussion that patents should be sort of not drafted in a way that they undermine this exclusion, yeah. And that is a debate we even have in Euroseeds, yeah. So there are discussions because there is still not that 100% clarity on the separation of the two, but in principle, in the law, it is clear that they are excluded.
Okay, does anyone want to add something on that? Ania, please.
Maybe I want to add something, because this is maybe also one of the reasons why I think the whole gene editing proposal should be seen separate from the patenting issue, because there are a lot of contested patents that don't even make use of gene editing. So I think, in my opinion at least, the discussion should be on expanding what the definition is of a natural gene.
And maybe if I may add on that, I would also bring another consideration into the discussion, maybe also in view of my earlier remarks. It would be, I mean, it's clear that we have carved out natural genes or native genes characteristics from plant patenting, but we still argue that gene editing techniques are indistinguishable from natural traits. So why would we still allow for patents on gene-edited plants while native traits are out? So there's also a discrepancy in there. So, which I think adds up to my earlier remark that extending the scope of patenting to gene-edited traits is not per se necessary, and we could live with plant breeders' rights.
Okay, brilliant. So we've reached the end of this session. I would just like to wrap up with a very last question. 20 seconds response, okay, so it has to be quick, because we're talking here about gene editing, but actually at the end of the day we're talking about innovation, we're talking about technology, and all of this will continue to develop. Won't stop with gene editing, new things will come, and at the end of the day we need to somehow communicate about innovation and technology, right? It's not just about gene editing. So my question to you is, how do we instill trust in breeding innovation, breeding technology? Is it about the science? Is that how we're going to convince, people? Or is it about the experience? To come back to Dan's point on actually eating the salad at the end of the day. What would you say? Ania, science or experience?
I think it's a combination of both, because if we're talking about plants, that's really an experience. If you go to a restaurant, you really experience something. But it's also about research, because if you look at Europe at least, we don't have any crops yet, gene-edited crops on the market, but there are already gene therapy that is being used in the European Union. And then when you talk about the research behind that, then a lot of people are accepting when it comes to gene therapy, but then to crops, it's a different story. So then I think you really have to combine the two.
Okay, combine the two. Arend, science or experience?
I would say that results in the big topic of plant breeding, and explain plant breeding in a proper way to consumers. How plant breeding, in a broad sense, combining experience and science, can contribute to their daily lives.
Brilliant. Thank you. Claudia?
I had a second to think about it. So I think the best impression you can get is if you go to a field, for instance with sugar beets, which are destroyed by a virus. And this happens in one season. and they are not usable for the sugar industry anymore. When you see that, you know that you need an answer quickly to that. Yeah, you need a resistance, you need to introduce that into your varieties. And once you have seen that, I think you are convinced, and this is science and experience.
Brilliant. Thank you, Dan.
I think about how I actually build trust with another human being. It is experience. And if they've got competency and can explain things to me, that's helpful. But it's about their actions over time and my experience, whether it's positive or not with them. And so if you give somebody a positive experience, think about that personally. That's how you build trust.
Brilliant. A warm round of applause to our 4 panelists. Thank you again to Corteva for sponsoring this event, and enjoy the rest of the Congress. Bye-bye.